In the late 1960s and early 70s, the public image of Batman was a campy, lighthearted figure. But starting in the mid-70s, he went through a dramatic transition. Batman became a darker and more complex character. And few creators are as responsible for this shift as artist Marshall Rogers. Today, we dive into the career of one of the most iconic Batman artists of all time. Marshall Rogers' visual style was characterized by clean lines, dramatic shadows, and a cinematic approach to storytelling. His ability to blend architectural accuracy with a sense of movement and emotion set a new standard for comic book artistry. In this video, we're going to explore his contributions to The Dark Knight, Gotham City, and the larger comics world. Marshall Rogers was born on January 22, 1950, in Flushing, New York. After learning mechanical drawing in high school, he pursued architecture at Kent State University, but he soon realized his true passion lay in the world of comic books. The artist later stated that he quickly found out that the world wasn't ready for another Frank Lloyd Wright, and I would end up doing parking lots and designing heating cooling systems. I'd wanted to draw and be imaginative, and then there was one last stumbling block, and that was calculus. I just couldn't grasp those weird theories that were running around. While Rogers found the architecture field was not for him, the blend of mechanical precision and creative flair would later define his artistic style. After bouncing around a few jobs, he found work at DC retouching panels of classic Batman adventures from the 1940s so they could be reprinted. Continuing to show samples after a few rejections, he finally secured his first assignment at Marvel, drawing The Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, featuring characters like Iron Fist and Misty Knight. Having made his professional debut, his meticulous attention to detail and striking panel layouts quickly caught on with comic readers. Marshall Rogers and Steve Englehart's run on Detective Comics began with issue 471 in 1977. This particular dynamic duo was only together for a short period, but their collaboration left an indelible mark on the Dark Knight's legacy. Marshall Rogers' art was revolutionary. His clean lines, dynamic compositions, and attention to architectural detail in Gotham City brought a new level of realism and sophistication to Batman comics. His rendition of Batman was both heroic and mysterious, a perfect visual representation of the Caped Crusader. Rogers' rendition of the character went on to become a big influence on the later adaptations of Batman in the comics and media of the 80s and 90s. Steve Englehart, for his part, brought depth and nuance to the storytelling. He understood the duality of Bruce Wayne and Batman, and he wasn't afraid to explore the psychological aspects of the character. Englehart's writing was filled with complex villains, intriguing plots, and a touch of noir that perfectly complemented Rogers' artwork. One of the most memorable stories from their run is The Laughing Fish, featuring the Joker. You may remember this tale from an episode of the 90s animated series, which combines this and another Neil Adams Batman adventure into an almost verbatim adaptation. Englehart and Rogers gave us a Joker who was terrifying without sacrificing his dark sense of humor, setting the stage for future interpretations of the character. Another standout is the reintroduction of Hugo Strange, a villain who had been absent from Batman comics for decades. Strange's obsession with Batman's identity added a really cool psychological layer to the narrative. The villain Deadshot was another character who was completely revitalized in the Englehart-Rogers run. He'd first appeared in 1950 in Batman issue 59, but would hardly be recognizable to comic readers today. Floyd Lawton's original look was a tuxedo, mask, and a top hat, and he was pretty forgettable, which is why he was more or less forgotten for almost 30 years, until Rogers redesigned him to his classic look, which is the basis for every version of Deadshot since this issue hit stands. Englehart also introduced Silver St. Cloud, one of Bruce Wayne's most significant love interests. Silver was a strong, intelligent character who discovered Batman's secret identity, adding personal stakes to Bruce's crime-fighting life. Their relationship brought a human element to the story, making Batman more relatable and his mission more tragic. The combination of gothic visuals, complex villains, and a psychologically rich Batman became the standard for years to come, steering it well away from the campy image of the 1960s TV show. Fans and colleagues were quick to recognize Rogers' take on the Batman and his world. He was nominated for 2 Eagle Awards and was given an Inkpot Award at the 1979 San Diego Comic-Con. while other artists, such as Neil Adams and Jim Aparo, had brought realism and dark shadows back to the streets of Gotham City. Rogers and Englehart combined their dark approach with an eye on elements and characters from Batman's history to become a definitive take. While the colors and separating make the art look of its time, had this been colored by the artist, with today's tools, I believe it would still hold up to any other take on the characters. The influence of this run continued for decades. You can see their impact in later works like Frank Miller's Batman Year One and The Dark Knight Returns, Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, and even Tim Burton's 1989 Batman film. In fact, in 1989, when Batmania was sweeping the nation, Marshall Rogers was the artist selected to illustrate Batman's high-profile return to newspaper strips. It lasted about a year, but included some great work that you can find reprinted in Comics Review 41 through 43. If you're a fan of comic art like I am, be sure to like this video and subscribe. I'll have a lot more deep dives into the legendary artist whose work inspires us, and that's the best way to make sure you see it. Also, you can click on the link tree in the description right below to take a look at the comics this art inspired me to make. We Are Scarlet Twilight is a pulp-influenced thriller inspired by Batman and other heroes of the 30s and 40s. It's a combination of the Art Deco atmosphere of Golden Age comics with all the best stuff we expect to see in comics today. And my other book, August, is an 80s-inspired sci-fi space opera with some spaghetti western thrown in. If you're a fan of Star Wars, Transformers, He-Man, any of that stuff, this is the book for you. I tried to make it feel like something awesome from the late 80s that you get to go back and read for the first time. You can check out both of these at the link below, single issues, collections, or live campaigns. And let's get back to the video. While the 77 Batman run was his most famous work, Rogers' talent wasn't confined to Gotham. He worked on other notable series such as Mr. Miracle, a personal favorite of mine, with writer Steve Gerber, and Silver Surfer for Marvel, working once again with writer Steve Englehart. Also over at Marvel, he contributed some great Steve Ditko-inspired issues of Spider-Man. And Marshall Rogers' take on Doctor Strange remains one of the definitive versions of the character. Rogers' art continued to influence the comic book industry throughout the 80s and 90s, though he never quite recaptured the massive success of his initial Batman run. However, his work remains influential, inspiring many artists who have followed him. Tom Lyle, who's probably most well known for illustrating the Tim Drake Robin solo miniseries, as well as parts of Spider-Man's Maximum Carnage event, drew on a lot of Rogers' artistic innovations. The rendering style, layouts, and emphasis on detailed backgrounds build on elements Marshall Rogers introduced to comic art. And, in a lot of ways, the type of stylization Rogers brought to Batman and other characters, somewhere in between the streamlining of forms we see in animation and the realism Neil Adams and others brought to comics, was a big stepping stone to the types of character flourishes we see in the work of Todd McFarlane, who drew parts of Batman Year 2 before moving on to Spider-Man and eventually Spawn. If you've seen a comic page with city backgrounds that leap off the page and make you feel like you're part of the character's world, or characters that walk a delicate line between realism and stylization, you're seeing something largely influenced by Marshall Rogers. In 2005, the same team from that classic detective run in the 70s, Englehart, Rogers, and inker Terry Austin, reunited in Batman Dark Detective, a miniseries that revisited some of their classic plotlines and characters. It was a nostalgic trip for fans, and a fitting tribute to their earlier collaboration. A third series, Dark Detective 3, was planned, but sadly, never completed. One issue was that many of the elements writer Steve Englehart created in both of his Batman runs had found their way into the wildly successful films, but without proper accreditation. However, you can find the completed scripts for Dark Detective 3, as well as unpublished Rogers art, at Steve Englehart's website. You can find a direct link to that in the description below. But there was one other reason why this highly anticipated book never made it to the printed page. Marshall Rogers passed away in 2007, but his impact on the evolution of comic art is undeniable. He brought in a lot of style that contributed to the high-impact styles that we eventually saw from artists like Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld in the 80s and 90s. In my opinion, cementing his place as one of the greats of the comic book industry. He redefined the popular image of Batman. and his art continues to inspire fans and illustrators like myself to this day. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any favorite artists you'd like to see me tackle next, let me know in the comments. Until next time, have a good one.